Hello everyone! In this video we're going to talk about Ruby on Rails engines. Learning about Ruby on Rails engines is a very valuable skill to have because it will enable you to create your own extensions to the Ruby on Rails framework and to be able to share behavior that you will store into engines across multiple applications. In this video, we're going to rebuild our own pagination engine. I created a small repository here for you where you will have all the code from the video and what we're going to learn. Let's dive in the documentation of our pagination engine. As we can see, we're going to retrieve automatically the page equal n query string from a URL, and then in the controller we will be able to use this method to paginate this collection. In the view, this method here will expose a page object that we will be able to use to decide if we want to display the previous page link or the next page link. Let's get started. We can create a blank engine thanks to the Rails plugin new command. In our case, we're going to name our plugin paginate, and when we launch the command, Rails is going to generate a bunch of files for us. Let's explore all of them and open the source code. In our code editor, we can see all the files here. We're going to explore them one by one to make sure that we understand what each of them should do. The first interesting file is probably the gemspec file. As we can see, gemspec stands for gem specification, and if you've previously built gems or read the source code of some gems, you should be familiar with this file here. Basically what it does is that it describes what the gem is named, what's its version, the authors, the email, the home page. We won't have a home page here, so we can delete these options. It describes the gem in general. The summary option here is mandatory, so we're going to keep it and say that this gem is about practicing our engine skills. The description is optional, so we're going to remove it. All of this is optional, so we're going to remove it as well. The files specification is mandatory because it describes which files should go in the gem's distribution. That means that it lists all the files that are required for the gem to work, but not, for example, test files. Test files are excluded from the distribution. And then the last option is very interesting. It is the list of the dependencies that our gem requires to work as well. So in our case, we're going to say that we depend on Rails 7, but of course it would also work with Rails 6. The other file we're familiar with is the gem file, but this gem file has a little difference with the gem files we're probably used to. Here we list the dependencies of the gem spec. So this means that when we run bundle install here, we're going to import the dependencies that are from the gem spec, but also here we are going to list some development dependencies. So we'll talk about this a bit later in the video. Then we have gemfile.lock to lock the versions of our gems. We have a rake file. If we need to create rake tasks, for example, we could create a rake task to launch our tests, but we're not going to do that in this video. Then we have a readme to add some documentation about our gem. We have a MIT license in case we want to open source our gem and distribute it under the MIT license. And then we have 3 folders here. The first one is the bin folder, and it has a test script. This test script is used to launch our tests automatically. It has a few lines of boilerplate code to make it easy to launch our tests. We will use that file later also in the video. Then we have the test folder. with a test helper. The test helper also has a bunch of boilerplate code for our tests to work. We have here the first test with one assertion. Here the assertion says that we have a version for our engine, and we have this very interesting dummy folder. The test dummy is actually a Rails application that we will be able to use to test our engine, but we will talk about it later when we test our engine. And last but not least, we have the lib folder with the paginate entry point, I would say, where we usually require all the other files that we need for our engine to work. And here are the files that constitute the source code for the engine. We also have a tasks folder that we're not going to use in this video, but the tasks that usually go there are the tasks to install, for example, dependencies, JavaScript dependencies, or if I take the example of the Turbo Rails engine, for example, this tasks folder here is used to install Redis, to install the JavaScript dependencies, and so on, but we're not going to need it here, so I'm going to delete it. Let's get started with our gem. Let's create the page object that will represent a page in our engine. So, as all files of the source code, we will namespace them into the libpaginate folder, and we will wrap them into a paginate module. You may wonder, why is that? Let's take an example to explain it. Let's imagine that we had another gem that uses also a page class. Then we would have a naming conflict if we didn't have this namespacing here. So thanks to the namespacing, we can have a paginate page object and also another gem page object. So this is why we have a namespacing. It's very important. And as we can see, this namespace is also present in all the files that are in the libpaginate folder. So with that said, let's take some time to think about how our page object will work, and I created a small sketch to explain how pagination works. Basically, let's imagine that we have a collection of 110 items here. What we want to do is to slice this collection into slices of 30 items. That's our pagination. In the query string, we will have a parameter here that will tell us which page number we are on, and based on this page number, we will be able to retrieve items of the collection that belongs to this specific page. So let's create an object to encapsulate this behavior. What we want is probably to initialize our object with the collection that we want to paginate, as well as with a page number. So we'll do exactly that. We'll initialize our object with a page number and a collection. And let's also add attribute readers for this. And let's add a constant to represent the number of items per page that we want. We're now ready to create the records method. The records method is responsible for extracting the purple slices here based on the collection and the page number. So if we analyze our sketch here, we will realize that we always want a maximum of 30 items. Those 30 items are the items per page. And when we don't have enough items, we will probably want to have less than 30, but the maximum that we can. So it turns out that active record provides us with the limit method to do exactly that. So we will limit the items that we retrieve by the number of items per page. And then there's something else that we need to do. We need to offset the records that we're going to retrieve by a certain amount here. On page 1 the offset is 0, on page 2 the offset is the number of items that were present on page 1, on page 3 it's the number of items that were present on page 2 and on page 1, and etc. So let's create this behavior. We're going to use the offset method for this and compute the number of the offset in a private offset method. And this number is actually equal to the number of items per page times the page number minus 1. Let's take some time to make sure that this works here. If we are on page 1, then we want to have an offset of 0. And the offset that we calculate here is equal to the page number minus 1, so that is 0, times the numbers per page, so that is still 0. So we don't have an offset for page 1. On page 2, it's a bit different. We want to have an offset of 30. And if we take the number of the page 2, so 2 minus 1, that's 1, times the number of records per page, that's 30. And so this seems to work. Now that our records collection is, our records method is complete, we can implement the other methods of our page object. If we go back to the documentation, we can see that our page object is supposed to respond to the first, last, previous param and next param methods. So we're going to implement them. We will start with the easy one, so that's previous param and next param. And what are those methods supposed to do? Well, they're supposed to handle the parameter that will go in the query string. So if we're on page 2, for example, the previous param number here will be equal to 1, so that's the current page number minus 1, and the reverse is true for the next param. So if we're on page 2, then the next param will be 3. So let's quickly implement them. Number minus 1, the page number plus 1 here. And let's implement the other methods, so the first and last page. So if we're the first page, it means that our page number is equal to 1. And if we're the last page, that means that our page number is equal to what? Is equal to the size of the collection divided by the number of items per page, and we're going to take the seal of that. Actually, we're just going to use bigger than here, because we will consider that if we're on page 5 here, that's also the last page. We could argue on this, but this is not very important for what we're going to do here. What we're going to do is to learn how to test our engine now that our page object is ready. We are going to use the test dummy Rails application to test our code. What is great about the test dummy app is that it's a real Rails application. So when we cd into the test dummy folder, then we gain access to all the methods and commands that we could use with Ruby on Rails by default. So we can, for example, run the generator to generate a model named recording. Here we go. And just like in normal Ruby on Rails, this is going to generate a model and a migration file, as well as fixtures and model tests. So let's create a seed file in db seeds.rb and make sure it's in db and not in the migration. So I'm just going to move it here. Yeah, okay, so it worked. And just like in the sketch, that I showed you before, we're going to create 110 recordings. Here we go. And to make sure that the seeds are idempotent, we're going to make sure that every time we run the seeds, we destroy all the recordings and we create 110 of them to make sure that in our database we always have 110 recordings. So now we could run our migration with this kind of command. Oh, sorry. But it's a better practice to use the bin test folder to run this type of commands. That way, if other contributors want to contribute to our engine, they don't have to think about the setup. Everything is done in a script and is automated. So here we can put preparing test database, and we can use the backticks here. The backticks in Ruby means run a shell command. So we can go into the test dummy folder and we can just run the bin rails db prepare and db seed command. That way everything is automated, and every time we run the bin test command, the script will take care of the setup for us. Now let's start testing. We can go into the test directory and create our page test. Like in every test file, we have to require the test helper, and like in any Ruby on Rails application, we can start our tests. So we can create a class that we're going to call page test, and it will inherit from active support test case, just like in real Rails applications. And the first method we want to test probably is the record method here. So let's write a test for the records method, and what we're going to test is that the 30 first records are returned when we create a page with the number 1, and the 20 last records are returned when the page number is 4 here. So we can say assert equal recording, and we take the first 30 of them, and this is equal to paginate .new, and we pass the page number 1 and the collection of all the recordings, and we call the method records on that. So this should work, and we're going to do almost the same thing for the last page. So we're going to say that we expect the page number 4 to return the last 20 recordings when we call the records method on it. So this will not work immediately because there's something important we forgot to do. That is to require the paginate page file inside the entry point here. So this is something that we have to think about. We're not in Rails anymore, so we have to do our requires ourselves. And now we are ready to launch our tests. So I'm just going to kill this command and run the bin test. Oh, I'm inside the dummy folder, so I have to go back to the engine's root to run the bin test command. And as we can see, when I run the bin test command, then the database is being prepared for me because we added our small script inside the bin test file here. And let's go back to our console. It's taking a little time here, I don't know why. And well, it's finished and our test passed. So we are now going to finish our tests by testing the other commands. So let's test the previous param method. We can say that we expect the previous param to be equal to 1 when we call it on the page number 2. So we're going to take the page number 2, we're going to pass it the collection of all recordings, and we're going to call previous param on this. The next param is 3. So when we test next param, we expect the next param to be equal to 3 when we are on page 2. So here it's next param. And let's launch our tests once again. As we can see, the tests are still green, so this is excellent. And we have 2 more methods to test. So the first one is the first method. So the first method should be true when we are on page 1. So when we're on page 1 and we have tons of recordings, this should be true, and this should not be true. When we're on page 2, then page 2 is not the first page. And we're also going to test the last method. So we're going to expect the page number 4 to be the last page, and we're going to expect the page number 3 not to be the last page. So let's run our tests one more time to make sure that our page object behaves like we want. So as we can see, I made a little typo here, so let's quickly correct it before we move on and run our test suite again. So this is one of the reasons why we make tests. And as we can see, our test suite is now green. There's just one more thing I'd like to mention about this test suite, is that as we can see, we used a lot of magic numbers here, and it would probably be a good idea to use the paginate page per page constant here instead of the magic number. And that's also true for the seed, where I use this magic number here. That way, if we were to change this number, we wouldn't break our whole test suite. So this is something we have to keep in mind for real life, but in this video, for convenience, I'm just going to leave those magic numbers here. Now that our page object is created and well tested, it's time to talk about the public API. If we go back to the documentation, we can see that we have this method that we can access from any controller that's in charge of instantiating the page object. Of course, we could directly instantiate the paginate page object ourselves, but that wouldn't be a very nice API, as it would be complicated to remember. So we prefer to have a nice method that explains what's going on for the developers who are going to use our engine to remember. So let's implement this method, and we're going to add it inside a module with the name of controller. So let's create this module and let's implement the method. It takes a collection as an argument, and it instantiates the page object based on the page number that's in the query param. So we're going to create a method for this current page param, and based on the collection, and it returns the record that belongs to that specific page in order to be able to do this assignment here. So it returns page.records. Now we have to implement the method that is in charge of extracting the page number from the params. So we're going to write it down. If the page params converted to an integer is greater than 0, then we're going to assume that this is the page number. Else we're going to assume that the page number is 1, so that we are on the first page. And we can also make all these methods private, as we will only use them from inside controllers. Now that we have created our module, it's time to think about how we're going to use it. So in order to be able to use this method inside all of the controllers, it has to come from somewhere. And this somewhere is ActionController base. We're going to include this module inside ActionController base, and as all the controllers inherits from application controller that itself inherits from ActionController base, we will be able to use this method inside all of our controllers. But how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use the Railtie. The Railtie is a special class in Rails that's at the heart of the Rails framework, and it exposes lots of hooks to be able to manipulate the Rails base class when the app is initialized. So we're going to write one of them, paginate controller. So the initializer method takes a string that describes what's happening as an argument and a block. And in the block, we're going to say that when ActionController base loads, then we're going to include the module. So ActionController base, we're going to include the paginate controller module that we just created. We also need to make sure that we import the controller from our, I would say, manifest file for the engine. Now we are going to be able to test this from the test dummy application. This time we want to perform some kind of manual tests within the test dummy, and just like any Ruby on Rails application, it is possible to create some routes inside the config routes file. So we're going to say that we have, I don't know, resources, recordings only, index, like this. And we're going to create a controller, recordings controller.rb, and this recordings controller inherits from application controller, just like it would in any Ruby on Rails application, and we can create the index method that will use our gem. So we can copy this line from the documentation, and of course, to make it work, we're going to need some views, just like in any Ruby on Rails application. So we're going to create a new folder, recordings, and we're going to create two views. The first one is index.html.erb, and it will be just like in the documentation. Here we go. So we are going to render the recordings and display the previous and next page links if we need to. And to render the recordings, we need to create a partial recording.html.erb, like in any Rails application, and we're going to say recording, and we're going to pass the recording number here, recording.id. We'll put a little hashtag in front of it, like this. So now we should be able to launch our Rails server. So let's try it. Let's navigate in the test dummy, and let's try to launch the Rails server. As we can see, it doesn't work because we don't have a Rails server inside our gem file listed as a development dependencies. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to add Puma here and install the dependencies, and we're going to launch the Rails server again. This time the Rails server boots and we can navigate to localhost recordings, and we will have a message saying that migrations are pending. So we're going to open a new console tab and run the migrations. We are also going to run the seeds, and we can now go back to our window, our browser window, and as we can see, we have the recordings. They are paginated. As we are on the first page, we have access, let me make this a bit bigger, we have access to the next page link. When we click on it, we're going to navigate to the next page. We can click again to the next page, and when we are on the last page, the next page link disappears, and we have the last recordings here. We can go on the previous page again and make sure that the query string is updated. We can click again, and we are back on the first page. So this is excellent. Our engine works as expected, but we want to perform a last improvement. We want to add integration tests, and that's what we're going to do right now. Let's create our integration test just like we would in a Ruby on Rails application. So within the test folder, we're going to create an application system test case.rb file, and we will require the test helper inside of it. And just like in Ruby on Rails applications, we will create the application system test case class that inherits from action dispatch system test case, and we will say inside that it is driven by Selenium using headless Chrome, and that the screen size is that size by that size. And this is boilerplate code that is present when you create a new Rails application, so I'm not inventing anything here. We also can configure Capybara to ignore the logs from Puma, just like this. That way we won't have any logs that bother us during our tests. Of course, to make that work, we have to add some more development dependencies, and this time it's even more than development dependencies, it's test dependencies. So we're going to add a new group, test, and we are going to add the gem Capybara, and to add the gem Selenium WebDriver to be able to launch Google Chrome or the headless Chrome driver. So let's go in our console and run bundle install one more time. And we should now be able to write an integration test. So we are going to create the file, and this time we won't require the test helper, but we will require the application system test case helper, and we can create a class that we will name integration test that inherits from application system test case, and we can write our integration test just like we would in a Rails application. So we're going to say that we want to test that recordings are paginated, and we are going to visit the recordings path, and we are going to count the number of records. So to do this, we're going to go to the index view and wrap this recordings in a div of ID recordings to make it easier. And we're going to say that within the recordings div, we want to check that we have 30 divs of that represents the records that we are paginating. And we also want to check that there is a link with the text next page, but there are no links with the text previous page. Let's run our tests with the, we have to go back to the engines root. Let's run our tests with the bin test command. As we can see, we have an error, ActionController routing error, and we cannot get the style sheets. This is because if we have a look at our gem file, we didn't configure any gem to handle assets, like SP rockets, for example. As we don't have any assets in our engine, we can simply go to the application layout and remove the style sheet link tag. This will remove this error, and we can run the tests again. As we can see, all the tests are now passing, and we are done with our engine. So that's it for our introduction to Rails engines. I will link the repository containing the code from today's video to in the description, and I will also add a link to the documentation from the Rails guides getting started with engines. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.